Hi everyone, it's Andrea Edwards. Welcome to part one of We Need a New Middle Class Dream and 1 billion people with a heap of uncommon courage. So what am I doing here today? Well, I've decided it's time for me to put my thoughts and solutions out there into the world in one comprehensive package where I'm sort of planning to do it across maybe 3 videos. So this is part one, where I'm going to talk about a common misconception, and it's really focusing in on the scale of the issue that we face, but it's in a different way than you might have heard it spoken of before, and that's why I really wanted to talk about it. Then this part two, we're really going to go into what growth looks like, especially over the last 20 years and looking into the future across multiple industries. So people have got a sense of the scale, because I don't think this is part of the conversation and it needs to be. And then part three, it's really going to hone in more on the solutions and go a lot more big picture. And hopefully by the time you get to the end of it, you'll see a path forward that you're willing to get behind, and that this makes sense, or maybe this is just the beginning of a conversation where we can come together and work out what our new middle class dream looks like. And it will make more sense when you get to the end of this first part. I'd like to encourage you to think of this as a first iteration of my thinking. I've been pulling this together and changing it for months, and I've decided I've just got to get it out there or I never will. So it's, imperfect, but I just think it's time. It's really time. It's very urgent now, and we need to start moving, but we need to come together to do this. If we continue to allow the people that are dividing us to keep dividing us, we're just going to be heading to more trouble, and we can't do that. We can be better. We can come together. We can build a new world together, and that's one of the things that we really need to do if we have any chance. So I'm focusing on the polycrisis, so it's across multiple things, but of course the main focus here is what we can do within our environment, but of course it all ripples out into all of the other areas like geopolitics and war, our economy. I mean, you can't talk about any of this without talking about all of it, because it's a big issue. And it's not just climate change, it's so many other things. So I'm going to try and pull something very big and very complex together. And that's why it's not a soundbite. So for all those people that like the 30-second, 60-second sort of videos, that's not what this is about. It's just too complex to be able to nail it down in a short 30-second spiel. So I am asking for your time and your attention to consider what I'm sharing. I'm also asking for your feedback. I don't think I've got all the answers. I don't think anyone on this planet has all the answers, but we do need to be having the right conversations with the right people in the room so that we can solve the crises that we're facing. Our leaders are not leading us through this time, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. And none of this is about attacking anyone or anything. It's about saying we're in this situation, we've got a problem, and we've got to solve it. And so what I'm attempting to do today is to share what I see as the solutions to our challenges. So join me today for part one, and please do come back and consider listening to parts 2 and 3. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think. All right, should we get stuck in? Well, hello, I'm just going to be down here on the screen or up here, wherever it appears. But I figured having some visuals would make it a more interesting presentation to listen to. All right, so here's part one. So today, I'm going to share an idea with you, a solution to the global crises we face, which is based on many years reviewing thousands of reports, books, articles, videos, podcasts, you name it. I've been reading it, watching it, listening to it, trying to find the answer that will give us the best chance to overcome the enormous challenges we face. I can assure you this hasn't been an easy process at all, and it's taken years of researching and thinking about all the different possibilities, honing it down to the best chance I can see, and of course months pulling all of this together, and I'm still going. So if you're with me here, thank you. I appreciate you giving me your time, and I hope this is of value. Overall, I'm hoping everyone can walk away with actions that they can take, and I believe that this should be seen as a positive presentation. However, I also know what is at stake, and that means I'm being as realistic as I can be without scaring the life out of you. I appreciate that so much of this conversation is both difficult to have and to hear, which makes it very challenging to do something like I'm doing here today. But I am showing my uncommon courage, which is something I believe in. Regardless, while I've had advice not to include this, I would not be honouring what I know if I keep it all light and fluffy. So when it comes to where we are right now, the evidence is very strong that we may not be able to overcome what we face because we have already gone too far. Equally, no matter what we do, things are going to get worse due to what is already in our environment and in our atmosphere. And we need to get prepared for what that means to all of us. But how much worse it gets and how quickly it happens is definitely up to us. And that means we must start acting at scale and urgently right now. If we keep waiting, it's just going to guarantee one thing: wider suffering. So this is a call to come together and unite, where we do our best and resolutely commit to the work that needs to be done to turn things around. If we can come together and work together, even if we don't succeed, it will be a better position for all of us to be in. Essentially, we decide on peace, unity, and collective action, or we accept desperate violence, chaos, and collapse. We need to be very clear on the decision that we make here. But before I do anything else, I want to tell you why I'm doing this in the first place. Firstly, it's because of these two dudes. Let's click on it. My sons, Lex and Jax. Lex is 17 and Jax is 15, going on 16. They know I'm fighting for their future and they believe I am capable of winning for them. Sometimes I worry that they will feel disappointed in me one day because I didn't get this right. My loves, I am trying and doing everything I can, I promise. Because the truth is, when they look into my eyes and tell me their dreams for their future, how could I not do everything I can possibly do to make sure that that can happen? I'm a mum. That's my job, right? It's all parents' jobs. But I'm also fighting on behalf of the billions of people in the global south who will face the worst impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. And these are the people who did the least to contribute to our problems. I cannot be silent when my neighbours, who often have no voice on the global stage, are at such risk. I watched immense suffering that was created during the global pandemic, with my neighbours out of work, out of money, and out of food. I fought for them then, even though it broke my heart, and I will continue to fight for them now and into the future. They deserve our fight. Especially as so many people, millions, live in structures like this right across the global south. These are local examples where I live, part of our daily commute, and many were devastated by floods in 2022. But the biggest threat to these communities today is heat. Can you even imagine living in a tin shed when the extreme heat hits? And we're in February now. The hot season is about to consume the global south, and I am quite frightened for what that is going to mean for all of us, but especially for communities like this. In many countries across the global south, we experienced wet bulb temperatures for the first time in 2023. In India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they've already experienced wet bulb temperatures for a couple of years before that. But 2024 is expected to be even more extreme, so we all need to get ready for that. Especially as recently in Brazil, before the summer had even started, it hit 59.7 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperatures, which is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a completely unlivable temperature. The challenge with wet bulb temperatures, of course, is we're not hearing about the number of deaths from the heat, and it's often attributed to something else like heart attacks or strokes. The truth is, we may never know the true scale until we have an event where hundreds of thousands or even millions die in a short period of time. If you want to understand what this could look like, read the first chapter in Ministry for the Future, an event that I do not think is far away now. Maybe 2024 is going to be the first year that we really experience it. For people living in homes like this, they will become deadly ovens for the millions who are forced to live in them, whether it's because they're living in a slum, a workers' camp, a refugee camp, or they are poor citizens struggling to get by. And we saw a lot of that happen during the pandemic. And of course, this isn't even taking into account the sort of work that they have to do, which is typically outdoors on construction sites or fishing boats. For them, there will be no escape from the heat, whether they're at work or at home. But of course, it's not just humans. All other life on Earth is at risk from heat, from the oceans to the rivers to our lands. Heat is definitely a major alarm bell going off in the world right now. Will we continue to ignore it? And it always leaves me asking the questions, can we survive extreme heat? And if we do, what ecosystems will start to collapse? What extinction events will we see happen? How big will it be? And can we ultimately survive if the life around us collapses due to extreme heat? We're not far off finding out the answers to these questions based on what I'm seeing and reading and watching. In the Global South, this isn't a theoretical discussion like we're seeing happening in the global conversation, especially which is dominated by the Northern Hemisphere. This is already here and it's already happening now. People are suffering from these extreme events in many, many, many ways. Heat extremes are already causing mass die-offs in nature, and many people are dying too. Those living in tin homes will increasingly struggle to survive, and everyone in the Global South is going to increasingly struggle to survive as it gets hotter. In nature, we saw pink dolphins in the Amazon experience a mass die-off in 2023 due to the heat. And in Australia, in January, we heard that birds are falling out of the trees dead because of extreme heat. Our ecosystems are under threat, which means that our humanity is under threat. To give you a sense of the scale of decline of our ecosystems and our wildlife, according to the World Wildlife Foundation, since 1970, we have experienced a devastating 69% drop in wildlife populations on average. This means monitored wildlife populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have seen this devastating population decline, which has all happened since the year of my birth. And monitored is the key word here. There are many life forms we still haven't even identified yet. Here's another view that really illustrates what this looks like in our world. 62% global mammal biomass is livestock and pets, 34% is humans, and only 4% is wild animals. We need to radically increase the 4% of wild animals. They contribute so much to our natural world, including sequestering carbon. So we've got to turn this around. The word monitored is a really key word in the whole conversation, as there are many life forms we haven't studied and even more that we haven't identified yet. Just insect populations in the tropics is not understood, and it's believed a devastating collapse is happening and we don't even know about it. Now, all life on Earth must face the heat. How can the natural world survive? How can we survive without the diversity of all life that sustains us? Today, millions of people are desperately struggling in the world, in both wealthy countries and poor, whether it's from climate impacts, economic burdens, or inhumane treatment. We have built a society that continues to fail so many. It never needed to be this way, but of course, greed has been our God for too long, which is the reason we're all in this position today. However, if we can embrace this moment for what it is, learn the lessons we so desperately need to learn, perhaps we can create a new human society out the other end, where we all live in harmony with our beautiful Earth, which means the enormous wealth disparity that exists in the world has to be squashed, because in order to get on the right path as a species, we must all become more equal. And that's all of our jobs right now, to work out how we can get on that right path. But before I continue, I want to mention that many, well, maybe even most people could be triggered by what I'm sharing here today, because this isn't fair. In the back of all of our minds, we all know we have to change dramatically if we have any hope of the future. But still, hearing it verbalized, it's not always comfortable. There's another huge challenge with this message too. For those newly minted into the middle class, and I'll share how big that increase has been shortly, just especially in the last decade, this could feel like a real slap in the face. Just as you can afford to travel the world, consume new types of food, afford things your parents never could, you're hearing someone like me saying you can't do that anymore. Look, I'm not telling anyone what to do, so please believe me. All that I want to do is share what I've learned by looking at this situation for years and years and years and looking at all the different possibilities that are at play in the mix. We all need to make our own decisions based on who we are and where we are and what we're contributing. All I'm showing you is that the possible problem that we're dealing with and the possible pathway out of the mess that we're in. Secondly, there are many people like me, as well as much wealthier people who have enjoyed the good life for decades and have also contributed massively to the challenge we face today. You're not going to like this either, but I do believe this group has the responsibility to act first and decisively. When we've made the most contributions to the problem, it has to start with us. So I share all of this with a warning. Everyone speaking up about the challenges we face is struggling to get it across in a way that is comfortable for our audiences to listen to. It's not a light and fluffy message. It can't be. It's also not a traditionally positive message either, but hope isn't going to get us out of this mess. Only massive action is. So I do appreciate where everyone is. I really get it. I've been trying to do this for a long time. But I think when we all dig deep, we all know that the world is changing at a rapid rate now. Escalation in the environment is before all of our eyes. And if we are paying even more attention, we appreciate the risks we face are now huge. Not just in our environment, but with our politics, economics, war, including nuclear war, societal disruption, collapsing institutions, lack of trust, and I could talk about so many more things. It's an extremely challenging time for all of us, but I hope you take this message today on board and see the path forward, because that's what we don't have right now. Something we can all get behind, a movement of massive change that gives us all a chance at a future while we can still do something about it. Just a quick message for the doomers. I follow you. I listen to you. I respect you. I followed the threads to the end with you, and I fully appreciate what you were saying and why. I can see where we are going to. But there are always three areas that I anchor my position in. The first is I do believe humanity is capable of massive change, even though it looks like highly unlikely that we're going to do it on time. That's the urgency in my message. Number two, nature is amazing at healing itself, which is something I've personally witnessed. And three, we have to try. We must. Our children deserve our committed efforts, and the biggest job is to convince everyone to jump on board. But my initial goal is to start by recruiting 1 billion people, so I'm going to need your help with that. So to the doomers, I hope you don't feel the need to rip me apart, but if it happens, it's fine. I accept that. Anyway, moving on. So who am I to speak about this? Well, I could obviously give you the professional rundown, but just you can go and check that out on LinkedIn. Instead, what I want to do is simplify what I do and how I learn. I am an information gatherer, a researcher, a thinker, a truth seeker, a commentator, a translator of information, an observer of the social media discourse, a participator, a human rights campaigner, an educator, and an activist. This means To learn, I listen to the scientists, the economists, the environmentalists, the activists, the politicians, the trade unions, the media, the business leaders, the influencers, the left, the right, and everything in between. I listen to the doomers, the post-doomers, and those filled with hopium, as well as social commentators like myself, and of course, what I see with my own eyes. People like me are looking this situation in the eye every single day, and we are not backing away from the reality, even if it is extremely challenging to face. And trust me, it's extremely challenging to face. But we do it because we are driven to understand it, so we know what we need to do. We also know what is coming if we continue with business as usual. So we're all doing our best to help everyone understand what's going on so we can all get prepared, because as the extreme weather events are showing us, wherever we live, we are at risk and we must get ready to face this risk. We are also actively recruiting everyone we know to change how they live on this planet, to get involved and influence their communities, and to speak up and bring attention to what we need to focus on, especially in a world full of senseless noise. Looking at my own climate journey, which has been decades in the making, but it was in early 2022 when I had to deal with the reality that climate escalation had begun, even though for most, that happened with the extreme weather events that we've seen since mid-23. I always knew it would be earlier than the scientists were reporting, but still, it was a shock, and it took me a good 18 months, I think, to process what I believe is essentially grief. If you decide to go on the path to understand this situation, please don't be surprised if you face this too. It is very challenging. But since then, to help me come out of the grief, I've been looking for a solution that will get us out of this mess and moving in the right direction. As I said, this has definitely been the greatest challenge of my life, finding this answer. For the longest time, I didn't think there was going to be any answer at all. And that was extremely hard because I'm an optimistic type. So anyway, because this is such a big and critical issue, what I'm always trying to do is make sense of the big picture, and then I draw all of the threads together to make sure I understand the problem holistically. It's not just one thing. There's many, and how it all crosses over and comes together requires wide reading and definitely a deep appreciation of nuance. None of this is simple, so you spend a lot of time sitting in the grey. It's not black and white, that's for sure. But it's also why I'm constantly challenging any views I form, because there is always new information coming to light. And I, of course, never want to share misinformation. There's also a lot of information lacking in the climate space for a lot of reasons. And understanding where the lack of research exists is important too, because it's another sign in gaps in our understanding of what is going on. Challenging ourselves, well, exhausting, is always so important, especially in the world that we live in right now. Because the truth is, from what I'm understanding, I don't want to be right. So challenging any conclusions I form is absolutely a critical part of what I do. As I mentioned earlier, because I've been paying attention to global issues all my life, but especially for the last decade, once I really understood the accelerating situation we were in due to the climate, biodiversity, waste, and the pollution crisis, as well as how this all connects with all aspects of what today we call the polycrisis. Do you know what the polycrisis is? It's still not a widely understood term. So the simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events all happening at the same time. And we know that this is true. It's a crazy time for the world. So here's a wider view of the issues under the umbrella of the polycrisis, and this is my interpretation. As you can see, it's big, it's complicated, it's here, and today we need to get our focus on addressing all of these challenging issues at the same time. As I've struggled through the reality of climate escalation and finding a solution to it, I finally can come to the conclusion that what I'm sharing here today is the only chance I can see, but of course I don't have all the answers. So I want to encourage everyone to really look into the polycrisis, understand it, what it means to you, and if you have a voice in it that can address any or all of these issues, please leap into the fray. We need all the good and enlightened people involved and speaking up today. Now, I'm not going to spend any more time. It's hard not to talk about it, but talking about all of the extreme events we're seeing around the world. You can obviously find that in the news and on social media every single day. But the thing is, people don't like to hear about it. And even though it's important to address the bad stuff, if people aren't going to listen, if you talk about it, then there's no point talking about it. So instead, from now on, I'm only going to focus on the biggest question everyone is always asking me, and that is, what can we do about it? We are in a crisis situation, and please be under no illusion, it is dire. We're on the cusp now. It's time to act decisively, globally, and urgently. So if you're still unsure if you should get involved, believe me, please dig into your uncommon courage and let's get going, because that time is definitely now. But of course, it's important to know that momentum is happening. There are so many amazing examples of momentum happening all over the world, especially in poorer countries and regions. The problem is, it's all taking a long time. And while I'm relieved to see more and more people stepping up, speaking up, and acting on solutions to the enormous challenges we face globally, today, if we really want to turn this around, it's got to all ramp up exponentially. So please do get involved. All right, let's get into section 1, laying it out and defining the challenge. So as a species, what do we as humans need to survive? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. I'm sure you'll include some of the ones I've got here. All right, number 1, we need air. If we don't have air, we can die within 3 minutes. And yet 99% of the air that we breathe is now polluted. Number 2, water. If we don't have water, we can die within 3 days. Whether it's our rivers or oceans, it's full of plastics, forever chemicals, and agricultural pollution. We are draining our aquifers to dangerous levels too. Number 3 is food. If we don't have food, we can die within 3 weeks. And yet, extreme weather events are damaging essential crops all over the world. Food inflation is happening everywhere, and famine is on the rise. Number 4, safety and dignity for all. We have record numbers of refugees and displaced people in the world right now, and their safety and dignity is not on the agenda. It leaves people exposed to violence, slavery, and of course, sexual violence and sexual slavery, because the majority of people are women and children. Number 5, shelter and institutional strength. Wherever we live, we need appropriate housing based on the environment of the future, not on the environment of the past, as well as the civic institutions that ensure our societies can run. Law, healthcare, education, government, our information sources, and more. As we know, societal trust in our institutions is very low, and we must get it back, because it is extremely dangerous to allow ourselves to stay in this position. Number 6, equality and equity. And yet extremists are pushing back on this in all areas, but without it, we really have no chance. Equality has now slipped back to 300 years until we achieve it. But if women and minority groups are not at every table where decisions are being made, the wrong decisions will be made. And number 7, consistent and reliable weather, healthy soil, or we can't grow food, biodiversity and bioregion regeneration must be our focus everywhere. We need to regenerate our land in every part of this world. To provide all of this, we need to be looking at systemic change across the board. Now, some of the solutions being proposed by thought leaders and experts are very technical and hard for most of us to understand, but the experts focusing on systemic change need to be heard, because this is where the real change must happen if we have any chance, and systemic change can happen much faster than what the people can change. But what all of these people are proposing is painful, and this is because we didn't act 30 to 50 years ago when we could have gradually changed. Now, this presentation is focused on what you and I can do about it, because that's really my focus. It's about us and how we can be contributing to the change at scale, because that's what we need to be doing. But let me give you one example of systemic change. And of course, there are many others that I could have given you. So a clear change is needed in our global economy. I'm obviously not the person with the plan that can go into the finer details of what this needs to look like. But there are people all over the world who are working this out and have worked this out. So find them, study them, listen to them, believe them, follow them. But our challenge is growth on a finite planet, and GDP as a measure of success is not our friend. So that's first, changing the system, not growth-led, but nature-led. And we need to be looking at lots of different new options. One example is universal basic income, or UBI, and that's definitely on the agenda, and we're hearing more about it. And UBI is a livable income for citizens. And I'll talk about how this could be used in some examples, probably in part 2 or part 3. But anytime you talk about this, and if you've been talking about UBI, you'll know this is true. One of the biggest questions everyone keeps asking is, well, how are we going to pay for that? All right. So, well, the first place is, why don't we start by taxing the people who are earning the most money? Because our current system ensures that the wealthiest amongst us don't pay that much tax. The average people like you and I do, but the wealthy don't. And we need their tax dollars because that's how we progress in areas like education, healthcare, our roads, and building the right infrastructure that we need for the environment that we have coming. That's what tax pays for. It's not our enemy. And we need to seriously invest in all of these areas as environmental escalation continues. So wealth must be taxed for the good of all. Second, AI and robotics. It's here to stay, and that means less human capital costs for companies, which ensures higher profits for those companies. So if they're going to be taking the humans out of the system, well, surely we need to be changing our taxation where they need to be putting a larger percentage of their profits into the communities around the world. And this will ensure that, of course, that inequality doesn't continue to grow. For AI, at least 40% of current jobs will be impacted. So how are we going to transform our economies to handle that without creating even more societal breakdown and inequality, sorry. I mean, that conversation, have you heard it? I'm not really even hearing it. So the other thing is we need to stop privatization and make essential industries public. I'm talking about water, energy, education, transport, healthcare, critical infrastructure, essentially everything we need to survive in a changing world. A system built on profit cannot serve the greater good when it comes to essential needs, especially when investment in this infrastructure for a changing environment is so critical. Nobody is ready here, maybe apart from Singapore. And finally, we must demand change. We must vote for it. We must fight for it, because you don't have to look too far to see many countries, the wealthiest on the planet, and the infrastructure is falling apart. Just take a look at the UK as a starting point. And this is because growth, capitalism, wealth accumulation, limited tax, and more became the accepted norm. Look at where that's led us to. We got it wrong, and we have an opportunity to get it right. So we have a lot of work to do to transform the current systems that we rely on, but we need to get to work. Now, just before I move on and before anyone attacks me, yes, I am fully aware of the PR campaign created by Ogilvy and Mather and launched by British Petroleum around the concept of the carbon footprint back in the noughts. Those against it say it's cynical of the biggest polluters to shift the blame to us, and I absolutely agree with that. Equally, the whole argument is that private individual actions don't increase at a rate sufficient to affect the problem in a timely fashion. Basically, where collective action is required to change policy and laws, it seems that will take far too long. And I agree with the focus on systemic change. However, as I will illustrate shortly, humanity has a scale issue. And until we start acting in vast numbers, the system will not change. So I really believe that we must lead the change and use all of our power to succeed, because as we have seen and are seeing, the system is not changing anytime soon. And we need to rapidly escalate action here, because today we're pumping more and more emissions into our environment, so we are not even pretending to make the necessary changes. What all of this is resulting in is overshoot. And we have been in overshoot since 1971. Do you know what overshoot is? I often have mentioned overshoot in conversations with friends, and they don't know what it is. All right. So here's Earth's Overshoot Day, which marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what Earth can regenerate in that year. In 2023, Earth Overshoot Day landed on August the 2nd. The first was in 1971, when we overshot on December the 25th, ironically Christmas Day. Today, we need 1.75 Earths to sustain what we consume. However, if we all lived like people in many wealthy countries, we would need 5 Earths. Then again, just the other day, I heard that some people, the way they live on this planet, we would need 50 Earths to sustain their lifestyles. So be aware of who you admire. To illustrate overshoot, let's have a look at how much waste in kilograms is produced each year by an average person in the most wasteful societies on Earth. So this data is from Visual Capitalist, but I had it redesigned by my talented designer, Ariwa. So these numbers are different to the overshoot data, but I think it sort of paints a similar picture. All right, so obviously United States is number 1. I was surprised to see countries like Denmark in number 2, and especially New Zealand in number 3. Let's add in China and India. So China had a wider difference due to the very different living standards for people and communities across the country. And with a population of 1.4 billion, it's critical this doesn't grow. But India remains very low, and with a population also exceeding 1.4 billion, we need to ensure not only that it stays that way, but that all of us look to join India. So let's get back to overshoot. And I always appreciate this graph, which shows when countries actually go into overshoot. For me, it's always sobering to see the countries in the first quarter and the first half of the year. So let's focus in on that first quarter. So I obviously need to point out 2 what appear to be anomalies here, Qatar and Luxembourg. Both are valid. They have very, very small populations with extremely high emissions per population. So it does make sense. Just go and do a search and you can find that out. But Canada, the UAE and the US, followed by Australia, Belgium, Denmark and Finland, well, we are all taking too much from our Earth, and it's long overdue that we address it. So how do we get ourselves out of overshoot? Well, can we take inspiration from Jamaica, Ecuador, Indonesia and Cuba? What is the average lifestyle in these countries? How much and what would we need to reduce to get closer to not being in overshoot? As you can see, to help ourselves, we're just not talking about recycling and eating a little bit less meat. We're talking about making a dramatic change in our lifestyle to get back in balance with what our Earth can provide. For those in the top quadrant, we must be looking at reducing our consumption, impact, and energy use by more than 75% as a starting point. We have to look across all aspects of our lives and start making changes where we can. And this takes time. It takes a long time. It's a step-by-step process, but everything helps. So for those in the next quarter, it's the same. But we also have to work out how we can get into positive territory too, and we must believe we can do it. But we don't need to just reduce because we've been in overshoot for so long. We also have a debt to pay. So we have to pay that debt back. And that means massive reduction in how we consume and live on this world. It also requires massive regeneration of our planet everywhere. And we really need everyone with wealth and money to spend to understand this and be the first to act. Because according to the Stockholm Resilience Centre, we have already passed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. Although recent news out of New Zealand, I'm sorry to say, stated that the ozone hole has not been closing and it is, in fact, growing again. So does that mean we're past 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries? I suppose we have to wait for the next round of research to find out. So for background, since 2009, 28 internationally renowned scientists identified these 9 processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. Our job is to understand that we must live within these 9 planetary boundaries and fix the harm we have already done. If we can achieve this, humanity can continue to develop and thrive for generations to come. But if we don't change how we live on this planet, well, we're not going to be able to thrive. So as far as messages go, I think it's a pretty straightforward one. Now, I could do a whole presentation just on this topic, but to help clarify what each of these boundaries means, as well as the understanding we must live in the green section to ensure the resilience and stability of the Earth system. So number 1 is climate change. And this is obviously the topic that everybody is talking about at the moment. Our climate is changing due to the increasing amounts of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere due to human activities. And yes, people are still arguing about this. I know. This means we are at risk of triggering tipping points in the Earth system towards a hothouse Earth, from which it would be very difficult to recover. Essentially, our pollution is disrupting the fragile climatic balance. Number 2 is novel entities. We have exceeded this planetary boundary, which is related to environmental pollutants, including plastics. There has been a 50-fold increase in the production of chemicals since 1950, which is projected to triple again by 2050. Plastic production alone increased 79% between 2000 and 2015. The pace that societies are producing and releasing new chemicals and other novel entities into the environment is not consistent with staying within a safe operating space for humanity. So to summarize, novel entities include herbicides, pesticides, plastics, including microplastics, GMOs, and nuclear waste. Number 3, stratospheric ozone depletion. The ozone hole is something most of us understand, and if you're from Australia like I am, we certainly got it because we were right in the eye of it. And while it's green in the report, there is a chance it is a boundary that has been transgressed. It is listed as the one boundary not at risk, but information is changing all the time, so keep an eye out for those sort of changes. The stratospheric ozone is the layer of the atmosphere between 20 and 50 kilometers above sea level that protects living things by filtering out much of the UV radiation. So please make sure you're wearing your sunblock and make sure it's coral reef safe. Number 4, atmospheric aerosol loading. And this is about microscopic particles in the atmosphere that affect climate and living organisms. So one of the issues today is because we have significantly reduced aerosol pollution, it is causing the massive spike in heat that we're seeing. Because there are less aerosols to reflect the heat that's coming into our atmosphere. So our pollution was actually keeping our Earth cooler. So this is a big part of the challenge that we are seeing with the Earth energy imbalance that we're experiencing right now. And another term that you can be aware of is it's called a termination shock. Number 5, ocean acidification. As we know, the oceans have been absorbing a quarter of the emissions since the Industrial Revolution, as well as 90% of the heat, and the oceans transform CO2 into carbonic acid. However, if it absorbs too much CO2, it increases the acidity level, which puts marine biodiversity at risk and makes it more challenging for the ocean to absorb more CO2. It also impacts species reproduction, marine ecosystems, and the food chain. So a big part of the story. This limit has not been transgressed yet, but it's expected well before 2050. Number 6 is biogeochemical flows, or phosphorus and nitrogen cycles. Nitrogen and phosphorus are essential, naturally occurring elements and nutrients for plant growth. However, if emitted in large enough quantities, it becomes harmful to the environment, contributing to global environmental change and provoking Earth system threshold, such as water pollution by nitrates, nitrogen, leading to eutrophication of fresh water, phosphorus, and causing anoxia in the oceans and the proliferation of green algae. At the current rate, natural phosphorus reserves will be exhausted in 50 to 100 years. Number 7 is freshwater use. Unsurprisingly, water is one of the 9 regulators of the state of the Earth system and is the 6th boundary that scientists have assessed as being transgressed. Green water is rainfall, soil moisture, and evaporation, which is now outside the safe zone based on global changes to soil moisture. Green water is invisible water held in soil, plants, farms, forests, and blue water is visible water, so it's rivers, lakes, creeks, and those sort of things. Both boundaries are transgressed. The amount of renewable water that can be used without compromising our ecosystems is currently well off track, as we're using nearly 7 times as much as we should. Number 8, land system change. Land use change encompasses the transformation of natural and semi-natural environments into agricultural land. So it's human activities on natural surfaces, which has serious consequences for the environment. Number 9, change in biosphere integrity, which results in biodiversity loss and species extinction. And obviously, we know this is absolutely critical for our survival. Biodiversity includes living things, ecosystems, and living species, which are being impacted by a few different issues: the degradation of their habitat and ecological systems, the destruction and fragmentation of natural environments due to human activities, the pollution of these habitats, the overexploitation of wild species, so overfishing or deforestation, the introduction of invasive exotic species, and of course, climate change. There are 2 aspects to diversity: genetic diversity, the variety of genes within a single species, and functional diversity, the variety of life forms and the interactions between them. We are now in the middle of the 6th mass extinction on Earth with a speed and intensity never seen before. So hopefully, as you can see from these 9 planetary boundaries, we're not just talking about climate change. It's a much, much bigger story that we need to be getting our heads around and commit to definitive action in all 9 areas right now. And as I get into the solutions piece towards the end, I'm really going to be talking through a lot of these ideas and solutions that I think are possible. Johan Rockström, the lead author of the 9 planetary boundaries, has said, "We're starting to hit the ceiling of the biophysical coping capacity of the whole Earth system." So as you can see, it's time to get into serious action. Here's the comparison since the research was first released in 2009. My biggest concern is that we're going to see it released again, say in 2030, and we're past all 9. I certainly hope not. That would be a stupid thing for us to do. So we've got to wake up to the extreme risks that we face. So here's a solution that I think is really, really promising, and it's called bioregion regeneration. So a bioregion is a geographical area defined not by political boundaries, but by ecological systems. According to One Earth, and I recommend you go and check them out, there are 14 widely held biome types. Biomes provide the highest order organizing principles for nature. If all countries hosting these bioregions committed to regeneration and put the best people they have to work on restoring it, with their Indigenous communities leading the way and working in partnership with their neighbours who also host these bioregions, then there might be a chance we can turn this around. If we get this right, every success would ripple out and help the next bioregion to thrive again. What we need to be looking at doing is getting to an agreement on our collective and global approach moving forward. At this point, I'm sure you can appreciate that we have a massively complex crisis on our hands, and because we left it so late to act, no easy transition is possible. What is required is a dramatic shift in all of our lives, as well as a deep understanding of what is required of us, or it soon be forced on us by nature and it's very important we understand this. What it comes down to is we decide, or nature decides, regardless, a decision will be made. What this means is, if we choose to hold on to what we have, we will lose it anyway. But if we understand it's in our interest to let it all go and transform how we live on this earth, to live in harmony with nature, we do have a chance at a future, but it won't be without hardship. Now we get to choose how much hardship we want to accept. If we don't grasp the challenge, understand what we need to do, and support whoever leads us through this humanity-defining moment for our species, then we're not going to make it. It's really that simple. Or if we do not decide and continue on the business as usual path that we're on, well, we're going to have a very ugly journey ahead. My message is about ensuring that we don't do that. Probably the most important message today, and one of the most important decisions we must make together, is an agreement of who we want to be as we move through this time. Do we want to unite and come together as a species? Or do we continue to allow extremism to rise and empower them to drive our future? Right now, we are moving towards a terrible dystopia, which means we will fail, and it's going to be a horrible time for all of us. Humanity has to rise in this moment, and we must vote. 2024 is gearing up to be the most important election year in human history, with 64 countries, including the European Union, going to the polls. This represents 49% of the world's population voting, and the results will have consequences for years to come. Let's vote for action across all areas of the polycrisis. We absolutely need to recognize and fight to make sure that we don't swing towards authoritarianism, which is happening in record numbers now. This is not the path through this challenge. No strong man or strong woman is coming to save us. And anyone who promises that they can lead us to success are narcissists to the core. That is not what this time is about. We have to fundamentally shift. If we continue down this path of voting in authoritarian leaders, it's going to be disastrous. And the momentum keeps swinging in this direction. For example, Trump's lack of belief in the climate emergency has sent environmental progress back by a decade. And just recently he was saying, drill, baby, drill again, right? In Argentina, they've just elected a president who has promised to withdraw from all environmental commitments. The Netherlands, Germany, France, who knows? The whole European Union could go far right, which will mean a significant pushback against environmental action. And that's going to be a disaster. The list is long for a rise in authoritarian leadership. And this should be a huge concern for all of us. Please vote, especially for the young, Gen Z and millennials. You now have more voting power than the boomers, and you've only recently gained it in the last couple of years. Please vote it. I know a lot of you have walked away because you don't believe anymore, but you've got more power now. Please use it, and let's make sure we don't follow the path towards authoritarianism. It will be a disaster. If we want to get on the best path, nothing's going to be perfect, but we need to head on the path towards community, care, collaboration, and yes, even love. But we're never heading towards a utopia either. I just can't even imagine that it's possible based on what we see within the human spirit today. However, we can head in that direction and get as far as possible, maybe healing humanity and helping us all redevelop nature consciousness. Nature consciousness is the ability to deeply connect with all life on Earth and the understanding of our role within the complex ecosystem of life, as opposed to thinking we are separate and superior. We need to understand that at the end of the day, we are in control of nothing. Nature is our boss. Physics is our boss. To get the next steps right, we must be switched on to what we need to do right now to change, because it's either we do what is needed or it will happen chaotically. We will be an incredibly arrogant species if we think we can win against the physics of nature. I think all we'd have to do is ask a survivor of an extreme weather event if they think we can survive. I think we know the answer to that. So the situation that we are currently in means we now need to start to urgently and proactively manage this process, or we will experience the chaos of collapse. And unfortunately, collapse has already begun. Look around, collapse is everywhere. So time is really of the essence now. We must move at scale and rapidly repair and regenerate our environment. Now, I really appreciate that this whole topic is challenging because of all the noise. There are so many vested interests pushing their solutions or greenwashing or talking about green growth. But when you read everything, you get good at spotting the business as usual money compared to those fighting for a living future for all life on Earth. And most of them are not getting paid anything. So what I really want to share with you today is the missing piece in this discussion, which is just not getting anywhere near enough attention at all in the mix of this ongoing scramble for solutions. So what is this missing piece? It's the critical role that you and I and all middle-class people can and must play in driving these changes from the middle. All adults, especially parents and grandparents, need to recognize and embrace our power so we can give our children and all children a fighting chance at a future. But first, I want to set some context, and then I'm going to challenge some ideas that have been accepted for too long. And because it's accepted, it means we're not understanding the enormity of the problem from our own perspective. The core idea I am discussing here is around understanding the numbers of middle-class people we have in the world right now and how that translates into impact on our biosphere, then what we can do about it. And to start, we must consider the numbers of humans on the planet, but I don't believe it's a population issue that we're dealing with, and I know many think that that is the case. I think it is more about the number of people who can afford a lifestyle that is incompatible with a healthy environment. So let's get into section 2, who or what is to blame? And of course, it's never one thing. It never is. So who is responsible for the predicament that we're in right now? Well, we've all heard that it's the fossil fuel industry, and of course, that is a massive part of the problem. We've also heard that it is 100 companies are responsible, or it's the banks funding it all. And we hear lots of variations, but surely these can't be the only reason that our world is in the state it's in, and it's got to be a lot more complicated than that. The billionaires are always top of the list, and they're sometimes referred to as the 1%. But based on the number of billionaires in the total population, defining them as the 1% doesn't make sense. So there are 3 common categories we hear: the 0.001%, which is where I would place the billionaires. And let's start with them first, because, no matter what way we look at that, their very small numbers are having a massive impact on the crises we face today. But are they the only ones to blame? And if they're not the 1%, who is the 1%? And is it their fault? And of course, we also have the 10%. So the media, scientists, institutions, governments, experts, many, many people are using a variation of these 3 figures to paint the picture of who is creating the most emissions. And the question I want to ask is this the correct picture? Now, to illustrate it, let's have a look at all 3 and see if this is where the problem is. So Oxfam recently released its new report, Climate Equality, a planet for the 99%. They included this graph, and a variation of this has been circulating on social media for the last couple of years. And when it comes to the top 10%, you might even think it's them, but are you one of them? So, but let's start with the 0.001%, so the billionaire class. They are the biggest individual contributors to emissions in the world, and they must draw down their emissions rapidly and spend their wealth on massive global solutions to the challenges we face. It's their future too, after all. At the moment, they just seem to want to spend it on their billionaire bunkers. But their wealth was gained at the expense of the planet, and considering the wealthiest people on Earth have personal emissions the size of countries, there is no question it must be addressed, and soon. It really is time for the excessively rich to be held to account. Not only are they contributing massively to the problem, they are not putting nearly enough of their money into solving it either. So there are 2,640 billionaires in the world. They have a combined wealth of $12.2 trillion. 12 of the world's wealthiest billionaires produce more greenhouse gas emissions from their yachts, private jets, mansions, and financial investments than the annual energy emissions of 2.1 million homes. Massive, right? They also contribute 0.04% of their funds towards climate action, with the vast amount going into their private endowments, which is their money for the future. And this currently sits at $1.3 trillion. There is definitely no question, based on the percentage of their wealth and their lavish lifestyles, they are massively contributing, and billionaires are accelerating the climate crisis with out-of-control carbon footprints due to extravagant lifestyles, excessive wealth hoarding, corporate greed, and investments in polluting industries. The super rich have us all locked into fossil fuels because they have the power over the economy, politics, policy, and the media, and they are backing a system that pushes overconsumption, which continues to make it much harder for all of us to get out of this death trap. However, we have only 2,640 billionaires in the world with a combined wealth of $12.2 trillion. But the world economy is worth $105 trillion. And this is where, for me, it always gets much more interesting. It's much bigger than them, even if they do have an outsized stake. However, their wealth is linked to how we spend our money too. And if we are truly honest with ourselves, the 2,640 billionaires aren't responsible for the scale of pollution we are seeing in our oceans and rivers, which are overflowing with plastic and forever chemicals, or our land piled high with fast fashion waste, or the fact that 99% of the air we breathe is polluted, or the degradation of our land and soil, as well as the large-scale deforestation, to name a few. Sure, they might own the businesses and profit from it, but if we only blame them, we are missing our own responsibility here. To reiterate, there is absolutely no question the billionaires are making a massive and outsized contribution across the multiple layers of the crisis we face, including their personal power to influence governments, but they can't be held 100% responsible. We have to dig deeper. And that's why it's really important, I believe, to remember that their wealth is because of us. We are buying what they sell, which is why we have to look at ourselves too. We are not innocent here. Besides, if we all pull back dramatically, can you imagine the impact it will have on them? So something really important to get clear on is the top 1% and the top 10% to see if this is the group responsible. So the salaries in these brackets are different based on who did the research, but I will continue to reference Oxfam, who state that to be in the top 1%, it means you have a salary starting at US $109,000 per year. And this obviously goes all the way up to the multi-millionaires. So it's a very wide view of wealth. The top 1% are responsible for 21% of emissions growth since 1990. So those in this bracket for all this time have contributed a lot to the challenge that we face today. I started my working life in 1992 and grew into the 1% as I worked my way around the world. So is it the 1% exclusively? So in Oxfam's research, it talks about how the super rich 1% are burning our world, and this is how they make the biggest impact. So can you see yourself in this? Do you release excessive carbon from your consumption, including yachts, private jets, and lavish lifestyles? Do you have investments and shareholdings in heavily polluting industries, which guarantees economic status quo to make sure financial interests are safe? Do you have undue influence over the media, the economy, politics, and policy making? So if you're in the 1%, does that sound like you? Now, the second bullet, investments and shareholdings in heavily polluting industries, is definitely one of those areas where any of us in the 1% could be, for sure. But I think that this whole 1% positioning, it's too wide, and it means that we're not looking at this with clear eyes, and we definitely need to be looking at it with clear eyes. So let's look at the top 10% who, according to Oxfam, earn a salary of US $38,000 a year. So in wealthy countries, this is not necessarily a great salary, and it could be challenging to survive on. But in developing countries, it definitely goes a lot further. However, I think most people in the top 10% emissions category would find it stunning to know that they are, in fact, in this funnel within the top 10% of global emitters. So, have we found our answer yet? Is this where the problem lies, with the top 10% of humanity? And this is where I think that we really need to reconsider the numbers, because I don't believe that the top 10% of emitters are the only people responsible for the issues we are facing today, especially when we look towards future growth, because growth is the problem. And recent and future growth is coming from a massive new global community of consumers, which is not being recognised in the conversation that is happening today. I believe Oxfam missed this critical piece in the research, which doesn't make the research wrong. It just means it's not covering the whole picture, and we must see the whole picture. So let's have a look at middle-class growth around the world, and we'll dig into the numbers for this too. At the beginning of the 21st century, it is agreed that we had 500 million middle-class people in the world. What has happened since then? According to Credit Suisse, the global middle class has tripled in size since 2000, and the global upper middle class has doubled. I'm going to suggest that that global upper middle class is probably the multimillionaires in that 1% category. Obviously, I could provide a lot more details, but essentially what the data is showing is that nearly half of humanity is moving towards the middle class, if they're not there already. Now, this is an issue that I became really aware of back in 2013. I was working for Microsoft then, and when I was doing research for an article on the aviation sector, and that was when China was building one new airport every single week, I came across interviews and research from Kishore Mahbubani and the World Economic Forum. This is a statement that caught my eye. The explosion of Asia's middle class was named by the World Economic Forum's Agenda Council as one of the 10 most significant trends for 2014. Kishore Mahbubani, one of the great minds in the world, and I definitely recommend you follow him, at the time said, the middle class in Asia is estimated at 500 million people today, but that number is expected to reach 1.75 billion by 2020, a threefold increase in just 7 years. And this, of course, is just for Asia. This prediction at the time was considered to be one of the greatest seismic shifts in human history, with 30% of the world's middle-class population based now in the Asia-Pacific region. The reason it caught my attention and alarmed me is because I could see where this was going. I've lived in Asia since 2001. Because, of course, we can only expect the new middle class to have the same expectations that people like me have been able to enjoy at least since the 1990s. The biggest question in my mind back then was, what impact would that many new middle class people have in such a short period of time? We were already aware of the risks the world was facing from a climate and biodiversity loss perspective, and it was already happening long before this new surge in the global middle class. And equally, the fossil fuel industry was very well informed. They'd known since at least the 50s because their own scientists were telling them that this was what was happening. And yet at this moment, it felt like we just didn't seem to have any need for any alarm at all. It was indeed the greatest seismic shift in human history. So while there's lots of different numbers and categories of wealth provided by research, it's broadly accepted that today we officially have 3.8 billion middle-class people in the world, and that number is expected to increase to 4.8 billion by 2030, although how that's even possible with climate escalation is beyond me. When I first started to understand this explosion and have since lived another decade in Asia with that explosion becoming a relative for all of us, as well as seeing the impact of this massive increase personally and in the wider world, I'm probably one of the people least surprised by what is going on in our environment today. When I think about it, it feels like our leaders, governments, business, the media and institutions just didn't seem to be paying attention at all. It's really quite extraordinary. They just kept on kicking that can down the road. But of course, it's never that simple to get out of destructive system. Governments won't change while businesses and the media fund or support them, as well as being subjected to powerful coercion by lobby groups fighting for their own interests. Businesses won't change while they enjoy such influence, and besides, they need to keep delivering value to their shareholders. The media won't change because they are owned by the billionaires and the oligarchs, and they exist in their own information silos. And we, the people, won't change because we're being sucked in by the other three groups here. And until we can see the destruction before our own eyes, we don't even seem to be open to the risks that we're facing. Unfortunately, when you wait for the reality of the environment escalation, that's when you get us to the line where we could be gone too far. But, at the end of the day, what we've really got to do is the change has to start with us and in huge numbers. We have to drive the change from the middle because our leaders are not driving this change. They're not capable of driving this change, and they're not capable of communicating why this change is necessary. But of course, the greater challenge for all of us and for most people today is we are confused, overwhelmed, and bamboozled, which is the strategy of many industries as well as those seeking to divide us, who are supported by the media as well as paid for research, which can only mean one thing: confusion reigns. And it's very frustrating to be constantly seeing this. So how do we navigate the false narratives, especially with AI kicking off into high gear? And how do we believe it's even possible there are humans in this world who would knowingly put us all at such risk? Because they have kids and grandkids too, right? I think that we have a very, very hard time understanding wealth and power, two of the narratives of leadership today. We need to understand it, especially understanding how so many people are so disconnected from our wider reality. We need to understand how the brain works so we can work out how to overcome within this existing system, because we definitely have a big challenge at the top. Understanding what drives people is critically. I think, just as a bit of a sidestep, it's time for all of us to study philosophy, history, as well as neuroscience, or how the brain works. In fact, if you want to do yourself a real favor, study gardening, self-defense, and basic survival skills too. Then you should be all set for the future that we've got coming. But anyway, all of this while living in Asia for the last 20 years, along with my commitment to tie all of the relevant threads together, has given me a different perspective on what I'm seeing in the global conversation. Because of this, when people say to me, how did you know it was all going to accelerate faster than the scientists were predicting? It's easy for me. The exponential growth of the middle class this century and all that entails, which includes the decades-long build-up to making it possible in the first place, when essentially we went from 500 million to 3.8 billion in 20 years, with the largest surge in just the last decade. This is where I would place my bet. We've all stood witness to the massive explosion in emissions and waste created from this rapid surge in human spending power too. It's before all of our eyes, and yet we're still not really talking about how we can solve these problems. What we are looking at today is close to 50% of the world's population is now considered middle class, and that next billion, due by 2030, are already buying more and living better lives, which I certainly don't blame them for. We shouldn't scapegoat them, and we shouldn't let the media or our leaders do it either. They're not the problem. We created the problem. Our leaders could have raised the alarm decades ago and changed our societies. And instead, here we are. When you look at All the world leaders that have graced the world stages, it's hard to believe that none of them ever stopped and said, wait a minute, this might not be a good idea. And of course, we know many strong people did speak up. Carl Sagan, Al Gore, Michael Mann, Margaret Thatcher. And yes, Margaret Thatcher and Reagan with Reaganomics, they actually were at the beginning of what caused the problem that we're in right now. And as well as many, many, many other famous people, but they were ultimately drowned out by the capitalists, their media arms, and the lobbyists, with many of them ignored, ostracized, humiliated, and more, including obviously murder, which is why we are where we are today. I think we owe a lot of these people a really big apology. So now we've got 3.8 billion middle-class people. What does it mean to be middle class? Being middle class means you have money to spend on necessities and potentially luxuries. The middle class is the largest spending group in the world, sitting in the driver's seat for increased consumption of goods and materials. 50 years ago, this group was small and lived almost exclusively in Western countries. Today, it is increasingly spread around the world, especially in Asia Pacific. The spending power of both the upper middle class and middle class was $44 trillion in 2020, and it's expected to grow to $62 trillion by 2030. That's 41% growth this decade. So more massive growth is predicted, and that's the problem. We're seeing the extreme weather events, the amount of waste in our oceans and rivers, drought, famine, food insecurity, fuel insecurity, and so much more. We can't keep growing the way we are growing. We need a new middle-class dream where economic growth is not the measure, but happiness and contentment is. We need less, much less, and it needs to be led by the middle class. Alrighty, thank you for listening to part 1. I will try to release part 2 within a week. And in this second part, we'll discuss where growth is happening, the scale of growth, and what we can do about it. Before I finish, I have to say, when I mentioned the 3.8 billion middle class number, many people are surprised and doubtful, but a simple Google search usually clears it up. So what this means is that we're now suffering a scale issue with 3.8 billion people wanting everything they are entitled to, the same things that people like me have been able to enjoy for decades. But at this scale, it isn't a possibility if we want a healthy planet. This issue needs to be addressed, and that means we need to look this truth in the eye and design a new middle-class dream that lifts the poorest while the richest massively reduce their impact. So come and join me for the next couple of sessions, and let's come together to solve the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced. And that requires all of us getting involved and designing a new story for our collective future. See you soon. Thank you.